It lasted only 3 minutes and 47 seconds. 3 minutes that would change the way the world sees Israeli-American relations forever. Benjamin Netanyahu had just finished his carefully crafted speech about Iranian nuclear threats to the UN Security Council. He expected the usual diplomatic nods, the standard expressions of concern, perhaps some measured calls for action. What he didn't expect was what happened next. Joe Biden stood up slowly, his weathered face carrying an expression nobody in that room had seen before. The American president looked directly at Netanyahu and said something that paralyzed the entire Israeli delegation. But what you're about to discover isn't just about what Biden said that day. It's about the secret recording that Netanyahu had been making all along, and how that recording would either destroy Biden's presidency or end Netanyahu's political career forever. The Manhattan conference room was thick with tension that afternoon of March 15, 2024. 50 world leaders sat around the massive oval table, each representing nations with their own agendas, their own secrets, their own fears about the escalating Middle East crisis. But only 2 men in that room knew that this meeting would mark the end of a 40-year friendship and the beginning of a political war that would reshape global diplomacy. Netanyahu sat confidently in his chair, his hands clasped on the polished mahogany table. For weeks, his intelligence teams had been preparing the perfect presentation: satellite images, intercepted communications, financial records, everything designed to prove that Iran was closer to nuclear capability than anyone realized. More importantly, everything designed to force Biden's hand into military action that would save Netanyahu's crumbling domestic political position. But in the breast pocket of his navy suit jacket was something even more valuable, a small recording device that had been capturing every private conversation with Biden for the past 6 months. Insurance, he called it, a guarantee that if their relationship ever soured, he would have leverage over the most powerful man in the world. What Netanyahu didn't know was that Biden's security team had detected the device 3 weeks earlier. The Israeli Prime Minister cleared his throat and began his presentation with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Distinguished colleagues," he started, his accented English carrying across the silent room. "The intelligence I'm about to share with you reveals an imminent threat that we can no longer ignore." He clicked his presentation remote, and the first slide appeared on the massive screen behind him. Satellite imagery of what appeared to be Iranian nuclear facilities, with red circles highlighting suspicious activity. These images, taken just 72 hours ago by Israeli reconnaissance, show clear evidence of uranium enrichment beyond the levels permitted by any international agreement. Biden watched from across the table, his blue eyes never leaving Netanyahu's face. The American president's expression was unreadable, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. He was waiting for something specific. Netanyahu continued, his voice gaining strength as he moved through each slide. "Our intelligence sources have confirmed that Iran has achieved 90% uranium enrichment. For those who may not understand the technical implications, this means they are weeks away from weapons-grade material." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "Furthermore," Netanyahu added, clicking to a slide showing what appeared to be financial transactions, "we have evidence of direct funding from Russia to accelerate Iran's nuclear program. This is not just a regional threat anymore, this is a global crisis requiring immediate action." The room erupted in murmurs. Several leaders leaned forward, studying the documents being displayed. The German chancellor was taking rapid notes. The French president was whispering urgently to his aide. Everything was going exactly as Netanyahu had planned. But then Biden spoke for the first time. "Mr. Prime Minister," the American president said, his voice carrying clearly across the room without any amplification. "Those are very compelling images you've shown us today." Netanyahu smiled, sensing support from his most crucial ally. "Thank you, Mr. President. I believe the evidence speaks for itself." "Oh, it certainly does," Biden replied, rising slowly from his chair. "It speaks very clearly indeed." The shift in Biden's tone was subtle but unmistakable. Several delegates stopped their side conversations, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Biden walked slowly around the table, his hands clasped behind his back. "The only problem, Benjamin, is that I've seen these exact same satellite images before." Netanyahu's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. President." "Really?" Biden stopped directly across from Netanyahu, placing his hands on the table and leaning forward slightly. Because these images were taken in 2019, not 72 hours ago. Not by Israeli reconnaissance, but by American satellites, over a decommissioned facility that hasn't operated in 4 years. The silence in the room was deafening. Every eye was now fixed on the two leaders, watching what was clearly becoming a personal confrontation rather than a diplomatic discussion. Netanyahu's mind raced. How could Biden know that? The images had been carefully selected, the metadata scrubbed, the dates altered by his best intelligence technicians. And those financial records, Biden continued, his voice growing stronger, showing Russian funding for Iran's nuclear program? They're real records, Benjamin, real transactions, but they're not funding Iran's nuclear program. Netanyahu felt a cold dread beginning to form in his stomach. Mr. President, I think there may be some confusion. No confusion at all, Biden interrupted, pulling out a tablet from his jacket. These are records of Russian payments to Israeli intelligence contractors. Payments made to fabricate evidence of Iranian nuclear advancement. Payments authorized by your office, Benjamin. The room exploded. Delegates were talking urgently among themselves. Some standing, others reaching for their phones. The UN Secretary General was calling for order, but nobody was listening. Netanyahu's face had gone pale. This was impossible. Those transactions were buried under layers of shell companies, coded through multiple international banks, cleared by his most trusted financial officers. How could Biden have accessed them? You want to know how I know? Biden asked, as if reading Netanyahu's thoughts. Because every conversation we've had for the past 6 months has been recorded. Not just by you, Benjamin, by us too. The Israeli Prime Minister's hand instinctively moved toward his breast pocket, toward the small recording device he thought had been his secret weapon. Oh, you mean this? Biden reached into his own jacket and pulled out an identical device. We've been feeding you false information for months, Benjamin. Every classified detail I shared with you about American military plans, every secret intelligence briefing, every private conversation about Iran, all carefully crafted to see exactly what you would do with the information. Netanyahu's world was crumbling in real time. The recording device in his pocket, which he had believed was capturing Biden's secrets, had actually been modified by American intelligence to transmit everything back to Washington. Every private conversation, every strategy session with his advisors, every discussion about manipulating American policy, all of it had been monitored. Ladies and gentlemen, Biden addressed the room, his voice carrying the authority of someone revealing a long-hidden truth. What we've witnessed today is not just an attempt to manipulate international policy through fabricated intelligence. It's evidence of a systematic campaign by the Israeli government to drag the United States into an unnecessary war. The accusations were devastating, but Biden wasn't finished. The recordings we've obtained reveal that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been deliberately distorting intelligence, paying for false evidence, and attempting to manipulate American foreign policy for his own domestic political benefit. He has been willing to risk American lives, Israeli lives, and global stability to distract from his corruption trials at home. Netanyahu tried to stand, to respond, to salvage something from this disaster. But the weight of the revelation was crushing. Around the table he could see the faces of world leaders who had trusted him, who had been prepared to support military action based on his evidence. The betrayal in their eyes was unmistakable. Mr. President, Netanyahu finally managed to say, his voice hoarse, these allegations are documented. Biden cut him off. Every conversation recorded. Every payment traced. Every lie cataloged. Biden returned to his seat, but remained standing. The fabricated satellite images, the false financial records, the manufactured intelligence reports. All of it designed to convince the international community that Iran poses an imminent nuclear threat that requires immediate military intervention. The American president paused, looking around the room at the assembled world leaders. But here's what's really happening. Iran's nuclear program has been stalled for 2 years due to technical difficulties and international sanctions. They are nowhere near weapons-grade capability. The greatest threat to Middle Eastern stability isn't Iran's nuclear program, it's the willingness of certain leaders to lie about it. Netanyahu's closest allies in the room, the leaders who had been prepared to support his position, were now looking at him with mixtures of anger and disappointment. The Hungarian Prime Minister, who had been nodding along with the presentation, was now shaking his head. The Czech president was gathering his papers as if preparing to leave. But Biden had saved the most devastating revelation for last. "And Benjamin," the American president said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper that somehow still carried to every corner of the silent room, "we know about the real reason behind all of this." Netanyahu looked up, fear now clearly visible in his eyes. "The corruption trials, the bribery charges, the fraud allegations. You needed a war, didn't you? Nothing unites a country behind its leader like an external threat. Nothing makes corruption charges seem unimportant like the prospect of national survival." The psychological profile was brutal in its accuracy. Biden had just laid bare Netanyahu's deepest motivations in front of the most powerful people in the world. "You were willing to sacrifice American soldiers, Israeli civilians, Iranian innocents, and global stability to save your own political career. And when that wasn't enough, you decided to try blackmailing the President of the United States with recordings you thought were secret." Netanyahu slumped back in his chair. The game was over, and he knew it. Every strategy he had carefully planned, every piece of leverage he thought he possessed, every secret he believed he held, all of it had been turned against him. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of the continued humiliation Netanyahu expected, Biden's expression softened slightly. The American president sat down and leaned forward, speaking directly to his former friend. 40 years, Benjamin. 40 years we've known each other. I was there when you first came to Washington as a young diplomat. I watched you build your career, start your family, rise to lead your country. And yes, I watched you gradually lose sight of why you entered politics in the first place." The personal nature of Biden's words was perhaps more devastating than the political accusations. This wasn't just about policy disagreements or intelligence failures. This was about the death of a friendship, the corruption of trust that had taken decades to build. "You used to believe in something greater than yourself, Benjamin. You used to understand that leadership meant sacrifice, not manipulation. When did that change? When did staying in power become more important than the people you were supposed to serve?" Netanyahu's eyes were glistening now, but whether from shame, anger, or genuine emotion was impossible to tell. "The saddest part," Biden continued, "is that you had everything you needed to be remembered as a great leader. The intelligence, the experience, the political skills. Instead, you'll be remembered as the man who tried to trick the world into a war to save his own skin." The room remained absolutely silent. This wasn't diplomatic theater anymore. This was a public reckoning between two men who had once trusted each other completely. Netanyahu finally found his voice. "Joe," he said quietly, using Biden's first name for the first time in the meeting, "you don't understand the pressures I'm under. The threats Israel faces, the impossible choices." "I understand perfectly," Biden interrupted. "I've faced the same pressures, the same impossible choices. The difference is, I never tried to solve them by lying to my allies and manipulating them into war." The American president stood again, this time with finality. "The United States will not be supporting any military action against Iran based on fabricated evidence. We will be conducting a full review of all intelligence sharing with Israel, and we will be investigating how far this deception campaign has gone." Biden looked around the room one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've all learned something important today. Trust once broken cannot simply be repaired with apologies or promises. It must be rebuilt through actions, through transparency, through a fundamental change in behavior." He gathered his papers and turned toward the door. "The meeting is adjourned." As Biden walked toward the exit, Netanyahu made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. "Joe, wait," he called out, standing quickly. "You're making a mistake. The intelligence may have been enhanced, but the threat is real." "Iran." Biden stopped and turned around slowly. His expression was no longer angry or disappointed. It was simply tired. "Benjamin," he said quietly, "after today, I can never again take your word for anything, and neither can anyone else in this room." The finality in those words was absolute. Netanyahu watched as the man who had been America's strongest supporter of Israel for 4 decades walked out of his life forever. The aftermath was swift and devastating. Within hours, the recordings of Netanyahu's private conversations were being analyzed by intelligence agencies around the world. The fabricated evidence was exposed in detail across international media. The financial transactions funding the deception campaign were traced back to their sources. But perhaps most damaging of all was the revelation of Netanyahu's personal motivations. The world now knew that one of its most prominent leaders had been willing to start a war to distract from his legal troubles at home. The Israeli public's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Protests erupted in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Haifa. Not just the usual political demonstrations, but massive gatherings of citizens who felt betrayed by their leader's willingness to sacrifice their lives for his political survival. Netanyahu's own party members began distancing themselves. Coalition partners started making phone calls about alternative leadership. The corruption trials that he had tried so desperately to escape suddenly seemed like the least of his problems. International relationships that had taken years to build crumbled overnight. European leaders who had been considering supporting action against Iran now viewed any Israeli intelligence with suspicion. Arab nations that had been slowly warming to Israel as a partner against Iran began questioning whether any agreement with Netanyahu could be trusted. But the personal cost was perhaps the heaviest of all. That evening, Netanyahu sat alone in his office in Jerusalem, staring at the phone on his desk. For 40 years, when facing a crisis, he could always call Joe Biden. Whether as a senator, vice president, or president, Biden had always taken his calls, always listened to his concerns, always tried to find a way to help. Now that phone would never ring with Biden's voice again. The man who had once been introduced as my friend Benjamin in countless speeches would now be remembered as the leader who tried to manipulate America into war. The politician who had built his career on being Israel's indispensable advocate on the world stage had destroyed his credibility in a single afternoon. 3 minutes and 47 seconds had changed everything. The question now wasn't whether Netanyahu could survive this scandal politically, though that seemed increasingly unlikely as protesters continued to gather outside his residence. The question was whether the damage to Israeli-American relations could ever be repaired, whether trust between allies could be rebuilt after such a fundamental betrayal. But perhaps most importantly, the question was whether other world leaders had learned the lesson that Biden had tried to teach that day in the UN Security Council chamber. That in an interconnected world, the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, and the cost of deception is always higher than the price of honesty. As Netanyahu sat in his empty office that night, listening to the chants of protesters outside, he finally understood what he had lost. Not just his political career, not just his international relationships, but something far more valuable: the trust of people who had believed in him, who had followed him, who had been willing to sacrifice for the vision he claimed to represent. The recording device that was supposed to give him leverage over the American president had instead recorded his own downfall. The lies that were meant to save his political career had instead destroyed his legacy. The war that was supposed to unite his country behind him had instead united it against him. 3 minutes and 47 seconds. That's all it took to undo 4 decades of diplomacy, friendship, and trust. And as Netanyahu would discover in the days to come, some things, once broken, can never be put back together again. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened next would shock even those who thought they had seen everything that fateful day in the Security Council chamber. The next morning, Netanyahu received an unexpected visitor. Sarah, his wife, entered his office carrying a single envelope. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it on his desk without saying a word. Inside was a letter from their son Yair, written from his apartment in Miami, where he had been living quietly, away from the political spotlight. The letter was brief, but its words cut deeper than any political criticism Netanyahu had ever faced. Dad, I watched the UN session yesterday. For the first time in my life, I was ashamed to be your son. Not because of the political failure, but because of what you've become. Mom deserves better. Israel deserves better. And somewhere deep down I think you know that too. Netanyahu read the letter 3 times before the full weight of his son's words hit him. This wasn't about poll numbers or coalition politics anymore. This was about the man he had become, the choices he had made, the prices he had been willing to pay to stay in power. That afternoon brought another revelation that would haunt him forever. His longtime friend and advisor, who had been with him through every major decision of his political career, requested a private meeting. What he revealed would be the final crushing blow to Netanyahu's already shattered world. Benjamin, his advisor said quietly, closing the office door behind him, there's something you need to know about Biden's information, about how he knew everything. Netanyahu looked up, still hoping against hope that there might be some explanation, some way to understand how his carefully planned deception had unraveled so completely. It wasn't just American intelligence, the advisor continued. Some of the recordings, some of the evidence about your plans, it came from inside your own security detail, from people who have protected you for years, who believed in you, who finally couldn't stomach what you were asking them to be part of. The betrayal was complete. Not only had his international allies turned against him, not only had his political career crumbled, but the very people closest to him, his family, his staff, his protectors, had lost faith in the man they had served so loyally. As the sun set over Jerusalem that evening, Benjamin Netanyahu sat alone in the office that had been the center of his political universe for so many years. The protest outside had grown larger, the calls for his resignation louder, the investigations more serious, but in that moment of absolute quiet, he finally understood the true cost of the path he had chosen. Power, he realized, was like quicksand. The harder you fought to keep it, the deeper it pulled you down, and sometimes, by the time you realized you were drowning, it was already too late to save yourself. The man who had once been hailed as a master of political survival had finally learned that some victories come at a price too high to pay, and some losses, once accepted, become the only path to finding yourself again.